But yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce James Gao and his presentation on Chinese-style modernization and Chinese-style humanitarianism. So James Gao is a professor at Shanghai International Studies University, where he also holds the position of director of the Center of British Studies and the Center of Sino-Briton People-to-People Dialogue, and director of the Center for European Studies. His primary academic interest lies in comparative cultural studies, Chinese and world intellectual history, and international strategic studies. He is a distinguished researcher of China Forum by Tsinghua University, an honorable expert at the Committee of Oriental Think Tank by Shanghai Oriental Media Group. Professor Gao is a renowned columnist for varied medias, both domestic and abroad. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can I make myself heard? The voice is clear?
Yes.
Yeah, I have to muffle. Sorry about that because I have to muffle and lower my voice. It's actually 5 o'clock in the morning time, and I'm not going to disturb my neighbors, And anyway, I know that I'm the last speaker for this whole day. I'm pretty sure everybody is very much tired, and I'm going to shortcut. And I would definitely take questions if it would be okay. So I really thank Bonnie to have me here to participate in this such a very interesting discussion. And my subject here today is Chinese modernization and the Chinese humanitarianism. And actually, my colleague, Dr. Sun Lin, has touched on some part of my speech. So I'm going to emphasize on something that is exclusively in my paper, and I'm actually going to go very briefly through some parts which has been touched by Sun Lin. And questions would be highly welcome. And the first part, I'm going to talk about the crisis of contemporary humanitarianism. And contemporary humanitarianism as a political thought is actually linked to the evolution of European modernization and has unfolded in synchronization with the development of Western human rights thought. So on the one hand, rationalism within the European political tradition advocates for the human rights, the rights of man, and it is actually the primary part of the Western humanitarianism. While on the other hand, Western thinkers like Rousseau take compassion and sympathy as the establishment of the foundation of the moral ethics of modern society. So this unresolved internal contradictory tension of the 18th century Western philosophy is starkly embedded within the structure and practice of the 21st century humanitarian action. Appealing to both reason and the human moral sentiment is a fundamental characteristic of contemporary humanitarian practice. Well, the current state of the global development has exacerbated the internal crisis of international humanitarianism. The world is currently facing a series of complex and interconnected humanitarian crises, the scale and the severity of which are very much unprecedented. According to the latest report from the United Nations and the major international aid organizations, it is estimated that in 2025, more than 305 million people worldwide will require humanitarian assistance. Armed conflicts remains in the primary cause of humanitarian needs. War leads to mass civilian casualties, displacement, destruction of infrastructure, and severely hinders the delivery of relief supplies. The increasing frequency and intensity of the extreme weather events are destroying livelihoods, and it really destroying the food shortages and forcing people from their homes. In many crises, economic factors, including currency devaluation, collapse of public services, are key drivers for surging needs, leaving the extremely poor unable to afford basic necessities such as food, medicine, and shelter. So, today's humanitarian crisis exhibit the characteristics of overlapping multi-crises, and international humanitarian aid work faces severe systemic challenges. And what is more worrying is that along with legalization and institutionalization of humanitarian worldwide, the crisis of trust in humanitarianism has simultaneously arrived. Some Western countries, under the pretext of upholding humanitarianism, directly impose Western values upon sovereignty nations. International humanitarianism has directly given rise to humanitarian imperialism as a tool of neo-colonial power. So, the second part is the cultural roots of the contemporary humanitarian crisis. So, on the surface, the international humanitarian crisis is directly related to the increasing turbulent international situation. However, it is essentially rooted in the intrinsic nature and development model of modern capitalist culture against the backdrop of globalization. In the letter on humanism, Martin Heidegger made a shattering diagnosis. All forms of humanism, regardless of how moderate, progressive, or revolutionary their appearance, are essentially abstract fictions about human society. Humanitarianism, by elevating the value and essence of man, precisely forges the more fundamental question: in what way do we actually construct our culture? Western humanitarianism is a product of modern capitalist culture. Therefore, it is necessary to revisit Marx's profound critique of capital. Unfortunately and undoubtedly, the globalization led by the principle of capital constitutes the main content of contemporary world history and international relations. Such an endless, ever-advancing materialist power originated within European culture and as a historically formed trend must spread to the entire world, drawing all, even the most barbarian nations into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodity are the heavy artillery within which it batters down all the Chinese wars, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what is called civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. This is actually a long quotation from the Declaration of Communism. Therefore, this ever-generating, insatiable, all-devouring power of capital must necessarily adopt an offensive hegemonic posture to level and eradicate all essential cultural differences, a trend that can't be altered by sentimentalism or humanitarianism. From this, it is clear that in the context of capitalist culture, humanitarianism can only bear decoration of ornamental significance. Allow me to say that. Heidegger clearly pointed out that under their cultural mechanism and modernity, the entire society is placed within a mechanized life picture that can be calculated, predicted, measured, and manipulated. Man is reduced to an abstract subject who obeys, depends on, completely serve this mechanized life. The value of life, the freedom of humanity are merely empty concepts for self-consolation. The infinite nature of capital expansion, the absolute coercion of technological progress, and the cultural tyranny of political uniformity, these three together constitute the inframing of modern capital culture. This is the Western civilization, the Western modernization model is essentially the modernization of capital instead of modernization of man. However, we must admit, in terms of common human values, peace, development, equality, freedom, democracy, human rights are common values pursued by every country and every nation. We also need to point out that true humanitarianism must be rooted in a life principle different from that of the contemporary capitalist culture, a value concept and ethical principle different from individualism. In this sense, I'm not going to say that individualism is some kind of evil power. Never I would say that. But I want to point out in a certain period of history, in a certain period of modern world history, individualism as an expression of the Western value actually does throw a lot of lights on human progress. However, we must admit the fact that in such a time of multiple world, we need to rethink the foundation and the basis of human rights as a common value of all the nations. In this sense, it inevitably points to a modernization model different from the Western path. This modernization model must be based on its own specific model of spiritual life, moral ethical principles, and the patterns of cultural wisdom. In this sense, non-Western civilizations is supposed to make unique contributions to the construction of a new form of human civilization as well as human democracy. The third part and the fourth part actually have something in common with Dr. Sun, so I'm going to just go very briefly. As a Chinese scholar, please allow me to start from the basic characteristics of Chinese civilization to discuss the reality and the possibility of a Chinese-style humanitarianism. Compared with the Western part, the spiritual life and ethical value of Chinese civilization exhibit distinctively different characteristics. The ethical principles of Chinese civilization derive directly from the daily life, which is the source of spiritual life, and the moral ethics. As Max Weber said, Chinese civilization is spared the tension and opposition between secular life and the transcendental world. The moral conscientiousness of Chinese civilization derives directly from the intuitive emotion and moral conscientiousness of human beings. And this moral conscientiousness originates from daily social practice. The Chinese cultural tradition from the beginning of civilization has highly valued clan kinship and the principles of group life. Family ethical principles became the main content of individual moral conscientiousness. In the secular world, Chinese civilization has constructed its own unique spiritual principles and value concepts. Let me just go very briefly through some points about the characteristics of Chinese civilization. For example, the social idea of a great harmony under heaven. Actually, I don't like this translation, but it seems like a very authentic translation because actually under heaven, in Chinese philosophy, we don't use the word heaven. Actually, the heaven is the life itself and the daily practice. The tangible life, secular life, is where heaven lies in, and is where our happiness lies in. But anyway, let's just borrow this translation: great harmony under heaven. In Chinese words, 天下大同. It's the highest pursuit of the ideal society. Its core idea is to transcend the narrow boundaries of individual, family, and state to achieve harmonious coexistence and a common well-being for all humanity. This idea is not a utopian fantasy, but a traditional ideal interpretation of a harmonious society, deeply rooted in ancient traditional Chinese political philosophy and the people-centered thought. Second, the holistic concept of harmonious unity. The philosophy of harmonious unity, 和合统一, okay, is the essence of the wisdom of Chinese civilization, profoundly revealing the fundamental law of coexistence and prosperity of all things in the universe. Harmony is not simply conformity or unprincipled compromise, but rather a dynamic, harmonious, and creative state of unity achieved through interaction and integration on the basis of acknowledging differences and respecting diversities. Third part is the educational philosophy of transformation through culture, 文教立国, 人文化成. Transformation through culture means to transforming the world with humanistic spirit, and is one of the core features of ancient traditional Chinese political thought. It firmly believed that most profound and lasting power of governance comes from the appeal of the culture and morality itself, but not from power or violence. Its essence is to win people over with virtue and cultivate them with culture, using education and the system of rights and music to unite people's hearts and soul, purify social customs, and achieve long-term peace and stability. The fourth one, the practical wisdom of adhering to mean and morality. Actually, I don't like the word mean, because we all know there's a golden mean in the Western philosophy, but Chinese 中庸, and I don't think it's appropriate translation into like the golden mean, because we actually it refers to different things and practice. But anyway, just follow the word adhering to the mean and the morality. That is, observing the doctrine of the mean is the fundamental wisdom of the Chinese people in their conduct and governance. It does not refer to mediocrity, compromise, or inaction, but rather a dynamic practical reason that seeks the balance in complex environments, avoiding extremism, and pursue what is just right. Fifth one, the ecological ethics of harmonious coexistence. This is a very, probably very popular question nowadays when we talk about human rights. Ecological system, ecological effects would be very much focused. Ecological ethic of harmonious coexistence, 和谐共生 originates from the worldview of the unity of heaven and humanity. Oh, again, heaven. No, we don't have heaven actually. In Chinese civilization, this concept views humanity and nature as an inseparable community of life, emphasizing that humans are part of nature and should follow its laws, coexisting harmoniously with all things, rather than view nature as an opposing entity to be conquered or plundered at their own will. Last six one, the principle of peace and coexistence. 和为贵, I think Dr. Sun has touched on very specifically. I'm not going to go on more. So actually, last 10 minutes, let's just use 5 minutes to conclude. And we all know that the Chinese modernization is a very important term that has been proposed in CPC's the 20th convention. I think it's about 3 years ago. No, 2 years ago. Yes, 2 years ago. And there are 5 features I think that Dr. Sun has touched on. But I'm going just to emphasize a very core idea. Actually, all the 5, the 6, actually there are more than that. All the Chinese traditional wisdoms, traits, and characteristics has been fully demonstrated in the CPC's, interpretation about Chinese modernization. And for example, how to make the balance between the poor and the wealthy, to build up a common prosperity for all, and how to make the balance between the nature and the human beings. This is a very important part. And the ecological system has been a very serious problem we human beings are facing now. So how to, let's say, as has pointed out, now China has been more or less influenced by capitalism for the last decades of years. So how to review and restore Chinese culture and value in response to modernization in the Western sense. This is really a very practical and tangible questions. And, to avoid the tragedy which has been described by Nietzsche as the value of emptiness, like nihilism, and how to spare China that kind of befell fate of nihilism is really a question and important issue, because we all know that to some degree the Chinese culture has been more or less influenced by. And for example, how to, let's say, spiritual life, materialistic life, and also in such a dramatic time of globalization, such a dramatic time of major power competition, and how to implement the Chinese value into dealing with the other countries in a bilateral and a multipolar relationship is really a very important issue. And China promised to demonstrate a very totally different, or say quite different image in international relations. These are the ideas that China is going to adhere to, and in the practice and the theory. But all these factors, actually, I would like to be incorporating them into the idea of Chinese humanitarianism. When I write this paper, actually, my original idea is talk about the human aid, human supply, something like that. But little by little, I come to realize when we talk about humanitarianism, actually we talk about a very core, central an idea about political tradition, about the political philosophy, about how to demonstrate the national and the cultural interpretation of rights, of value, of ethical and cultural principles. So in the name of humanitarianism, we are all human beings anyway, but humanitarianism, anyway, the last point is humanitarianism should not be monopolized by one culture. It is to be open to all the possibilities and be explored by all the participants from varied cultural backgrounds in the principle of a common value defense. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
I'll open the floor for questions if anyone has a question for Professor Gao.
Thank you, Professor Gao, for such an interesting presentation. My question has to do with the current international human rights and humanitarian law framework within the United Nations system, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. How can these values that you outline, these traditional Chinese values, complement what we already have? Because right now, I think most people will agree that there are limitations to these current traditions, humanitarian frameworks that we have in the international system. The first question is, how does the Chinese principles that you outlined can complement? The second part of the question is, how can the established international norms also reciprocally complement established or traditional Chinese approach? And I'm taking a dialogical approach to it, thinking, how does the local inform the universal, and how does the universal in turn inform the local? Do you see a kind of dialogue in your kind of the proposition about how humanitarianism can evolve globally?
Shall I reply now? Okay. Thank you. Well, international refugees very much impending problem we are facing now. And actually, I followed the trends of international politics for the past 10 years. And the word refugee frequently, are haunted the scholars' minds. And for example, the Middle East refugee, the African refugee, and the refugee in India. I forget the name of the people. I think Xin. Anyway, this is a very very serious international problem. We'll talk about how to, or say, apply the principles that China adhere to into the international stage. Well, first, I would like to say, to some degree, when we criticize international humanitarianism, however, allow me to point out the other side. I personally give my very strong respect to those people who worked for international humanitarianism. What they've done really are throw lights upon, today's people's heart and soul. And however, in my opinion, practice is more powerful than theory in this point, because only by means of participating and dedicating to the international humanitarianism could we have the real voice in the field. And also, I think United Nations is a very much an indispensable organization, irreplaceably important organization that could have the universal calling of the joint efforts in implementing the idea of helping each other without any political affiliated terms. And talking about China, I think what China have done, I did not make very specific research, but as far as I'm informed, China has actually made a lot of contribution for the international United Nations international aid services. But I think in the future, in my view, and China will definitely defend the esteem of United Nations. As President Xi has frequently emphasized, United Nations is in a core position in our international governance. So China will definitely make its tangible and contribute its real efforts and muscle for the defense of international nations. And also talk about how to develop the norms from the local level into the universal level. Well, in my view, in my observation, China is making efforts now. Just 2 weeks ago, I was interviewed by Turkey TRT, Turkey Radio Television, and the journalist just asked a very interesting question. He said that since China has been a very important economic participant in the world, and it seems that there's a growing tendency, some branches of the United Nations is moving from moving away into Asian cities, into Hong Kong, or into Shanghai. Yet we do have some organizations. Is it possible that some other organizations will probably step in? But I'm just going to say is that let's see. But China will definitely, by all means, with the joint efforts. No, definitely not. China will do it unilaterally, but with the joint efforts, with the acceptance by all those nations who have the common value and willingness to forge a world in service all. We're definitely to take some specific measures to implement such a principle. If it is now, last point, if it is a coercive power, I don't think it will be accepted. If it is a force that is, really flowing out of the national heart, would be highly appreciated by all the participants. That is Chinese philosophy. Never conquer the other nations by power or by coercion, but just to, win the heart from the ethical and moral perspective. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Yes. Thank you very much. A very wonderful presentation. I was going to ask, when you were speaking, you said something about the trust deficit that is found now in the current situation or humanitarian response. Now, when you talk about a Chinese-styled humanitarian system, do you envisage that there probably is something that may lead to a mistrust again, just as you have mentioned? So do you think, or looking at it from the other side, is it a system that you see would have some challenge, will present some challenges that will lead to a mistrust, so to speak? That's just
Thank you, Khalid. Theoretically, trust and mistrust is always possible. But allow me to make a review of what has happened in the past century. The reason for the rise of the mistrust simultaneously with humanitarianism being institutionalized is that some countries impose, that kind of so-called humanitarian aid in the name of the humanitarian aid actually interfere so violently and so brutally into the other sovereignties, domestic issues, and with no respect to the domestic and the local cultures. And again, I think Chinese culture would say that mutual respect is is cornerstone, is the fundamental for us to establish a world with mutual and trust and understanding of each other. Without any respect to the other nation's sovereignty, to the diversities of the cultures, how could we say, well, we just provide you with international aid, just take it, but actually it is a sugar, it's a sugar coated bomb. That is something quite unacceptable, and that is why, some developing countries would actually, or even I'm just talking about in a very shallow description. Some very serious problems is that, wars actually in the past history, wars actually were triggered in the name of humanitarian aid. This is something very much notorious. Can we just de-escalate the tension in the so-called area, have a real heart-to-heart, nature-to-nature communication, and in a very, very mutually trusted way? If we could, I think the principle of humanitarian aid would be widely and universally accepted. Well, China, and so far, if you have a look at the record of what we have done, in my memory, in my very humble research, China has never made any kind of case, say, in the name of humanitarian aid, we just interfere and violate the other nation's sovereignty. This is something I don't think China will do now and in the future. This is absolutely against China's principle of nation and China's moral ethical principles. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Professor Gao, especially joining us at 5 in the morning. We're so deeply appreciative. Thank you again. All right, let's
Thank
have
you
another
very
round
much.
of applause for all of our panelists today.